Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of X Camera. And before we start, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. Interarts Matrix is working in Waterloo region, and the Waterloo region is on the land of Anishinaabe and Neutral people. We are located on the Haldimand Tract, which was granted to the Haudenosaunee of Six Nation people in 1784. In doing this land acknowledgement, I like to remember the treaty of the dish with one spoon, which was a treaty between First Nations before the arrival of the Europeans to North America. And that treaty spelled out not only the duty of one nation towards each other, but also the duty that people have to the land and individuals to each other. So some of the tenets that I like to remember are: you should always take only what you need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. It is my pleasure to introduce Sheila McMath, the present artistic director of Interarts Matrix, who will introduce our speaker for today. Here you go, Sheila.
Thanks, Isabella. It's my pleasure to welcome Teresa Vander Meer-Chassé here this afternoon. Teresa is an Upper Tanana visual artist, emerging curator, and MFA candidate at Concordia University. Teresa is a proud member of the White River First Nation of Beaver Creek, Yukon, and Alaska. She holds a BFA from the University of Victoria in cultural anthropology and is engaging in an ongoing mentorship with her grandma, Marilyn John. Through her visual arts practice, Teresa engages in beadwork, installation, and upcycling. She adds beauty and meaning to the discard through processes that require skill, time, and sensitivity. Teresa has internalized and embodies the adage that the personal is political. And when she discusses her work and its motivations, she moves seamlessly through and among practical, philosophical, aesthetic, and psychological considerations. On a personal note, I've researched Teresa and her work for a while now. I first researched her work as a part of a curatorial project about contemporary beadwork that I was developing a few years ago. The exhibition that has yet to be realized, it's a project on the go, led me to the work of Nadia Mir, Amy Malbuff, and Audie Murray, all artists that I understand have entered Teresa's circle in recent years as well. So I'm happy to have Teresa here this afternoon to talk about her work, and I want to thank her for deciding to focus her lecture on an aspect of her work that is still new and fresh and in development. It's a brave move. So thank you so much, Teresa, for deciding to focus your talk on new stuff and new exciting initiatives in your work. So I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Sheila. I just, before I start sharing my screen, I wanted to thank Sheila and Interarts Matrix for having me here. I'm very excited to talk with all of you today. So I'm first going to start with this presentation, then I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I'm actually going to share some of the work that I want to talk about today on a bigger screen. And then we can have some questions and answers, and then hopefully have a discussion after. So Dine K, Kit Nelna Shonsi, Nogle K, Teresa Vander Meer-Chassé Shonsi, Shna Thiel Monsi, Shna Wuna Gandani Kliomonsi, Shna Wuta, Sid Vander Meer Monsi, Shta Wilfred Chassé Monsi. And I'm sorry if I laugh and giggle while I try to speak my language. I'm still learning. But basically, I introduce myself as Teresa Vander Meer-Chassé. My Upper Tanana name is Dalkit Nilna, which means woman on a hill watching over her people. It was given to me by late Elder Mary Tyon from Alaska and translated by late Elder Ada Gallen, also from Alaska. I also introduced some of my family, and we'll be talking about a little bit more of my family in a little bit. But first of all, I want to do some housekeeping. This is a brand new slide that I'm starting to add to some of my talks, and it's about grounding us in what the conversation is today. So number one is talking about tokenization. I don't want to be the token Indigenous person for you. So make sure that that's something in the back of your mind, that I don't have all the answers of what it means to be an Indigenous person, but I can speak my own perspective. Secondly, I'm a student. I'm still learning. I'm in no way a teacher. So all of the things and aspects that I will be talking about today, I'm still actually going through the process of learning them. Thirdly, talking about trauma. I don't like to talk about familial trauma or intergenerational trauma, things like residential schools and things like that. So I often avoid those questions from audiences. And finally, questions. Please ask questions. I think it's really important to ask questions. However, I do hold the right to answer your questions if it's starting to feel a little bit like it's bringing up past traumas for my family and myself. So that's where I wanted to just start. But let's get into it now. So Titsanik is Beaver Creek, Yukon. This is where I'm from. I'm currently residing on Lekwungen territory, which is Victoria, BC. So Victoria is down here and Beaver Creek's right there. Beaver Creek is home to White River First Nation, which is the First Nation I belong to. White River is composed of two cultural groups, Upper Tanana and Northern Shawnee. I identify more with the Upper Tanana side of the community. We're also a border community, which means we're right on the international border between Yukon and Alaska, United States. So I have a lot of family on both sides. In Canada, there's very few Upper Tanana people actually residing in Canada. A lot of us actually live in interior Alaska. That's kind of where my family is from. And this map here to the left is the asserted traditional territory for my First Nation. My First Nation does not have modern day land claims, nor does it have historic treaties. So we are completely unceded, and I'm proud to be. All right, next I wanted to talk about my family. So I introduced Shna Thielkai Monsi, who is my mom. This is my mom. My mom's also on the call today, and it's her birthday. Yay! So I just wanted to say happy birthday to my mom. I also told you about my grandma, and this is my grandma, Marilyn. We're going to talk about her in a little bit. I also introduced my grandpa when I did my introduction. This is my grandpa, Sid. So these are my mom's parents. This is my dad. I also added him in my introduction. And this is my dad's family. This is my grandpa, this fella here. This is him young. And this picture here is of his family. So I come from mixed heritage. I come from Upper Tanana, but I also have Frisian heritage, which is basically people from Northern Holland or Northern Netherlands, sorry, as well as Acadian French is my background. This is my kind of modern day family. So we're going to talk a little bit more about them as I go through my work and the importance of working with family. But I wanted to give a little bit of a background for those that don't know me. This is kind of the work that I do. I started with the shoe. The photo on the far left, is the first work that I ever produced that I was like, this is art. I'm going to make it art. The shoe is just a normal size. It looks deceiving through the photo, but it's applied beadwork onto a high heel shoe. I started to kind of run with that idea, moved on to like beading a pylon and things like that. And my first solo exhibition, my first series, were these beaded hubcaps. And I don't even know how many I made, but I made quite a few. And it was a really good entrance point to the arts community. Another entrance point for me is this photo on the far right, which is the first YVR scholarship that I ever received. So YVR is the Vancouver International Airport. They have an art foundation that offers scholarships to emerging Indigenous artists from Yukon and BC. And this is the work that I created for that final project. And I'm proud to say that this work is now in the Yukon Permanent Art Collection. But today I'm talking about processing materials and how did I get to the point of processing traditional materials? Well, it started with thinking about fashion, thinking about clothing. This is my most recent solo exhibition. And as you can see, I actually have one of the pieces behind me. I won't be going into detail of this work in any way, but it sparked that interest in fashion and what fashion means to me, and thinking about what we used to wear as Indigenous people and how we present ourselves in the world today, especially for someone like me who has light skin, but primarily identifies as Indigenous. How do I show my indigeneity when I seem to be so lost in a crowd? So one of the pieces that I recently made, oh goodness, I finished it earlier this year, I think. So this is a work that I call, I can't even pronounce it, Grandma's Shirt or Grandma's Shawl. And this lady right here is my Grandma Marilyn, in Upper Tanana Elder in Beaver Creek. And this work was also for another YVR scholarship. And I sat with my grandma and I was like, okay, I want to make something for you. What should we make? And she referenced to this photo from probably the 1960s, 1970s or so of her family in dance regalia that they created. And this is her sister, Bessie John. My grandma Bessie, who I call my grandma Bessie, although she's technically my great aunt. Grandma Bessie passed away early 2000s or so. So I was able to actually have her in my life as a young child. And it was really nice to have this influential person. She, was an advocate for revitalization of the Upper Tanana language, Scottie Creek Dialect. And she really became this matriarch figure in my community. So it was very hard for our community when she passed. This lady in the middle here is Mary Tyon. I mentioned her at the beginning of my talk, that she actually was the one that gave me my Upper Tanana name. And this is another sister of my grandmother's, Jenny Sanford, who's still with us today. And she's now kind of that matriarch figure for my family. So Grandma and I looked at these images, and especially this one of Bessie, and I wanted to interpret it, but I wanted to interpret it in a way for my grandma to wear. My grandma has a little bit of difficulty walking, so I didn't want to burden her with this huge dress. So instead, I made a smaller shawl for her, but with the same elements that we can see through the photo. So here's the work in the Museum of Vancouver that I recently went to see. And this is the back of the work. So I don't know, you couldn't really see it in those other photos, but this is beadwork on the back of the piece. And I actually beaded the Scottie Creek drainage, which is all the way from where my grandmother was born, all the way down to where she grew up as a child. So this is the creek that my family would have walked and really occupied a long time ago. So I beaded that for her, and I'm just going to go back a few slides. You can see here I have these little gold spots all along the way, and these are their camps. These are supposed to represent where homes were located, where cabins were located, where tents were located, things like that. So I worked closely with our archaeologist that likes to engage with our community, Norm Easton, as well as our lands department, to get some accurate information of where our sites are. So I was thinking about clothing and thinking about this past and how far back can I go in looking at clothing. I started to do more research into clothing, especially when I was doing a project for my First Nation in regards to language revitalization. And I don't know if anybody knows this, but Women's Work, Women's Art is a great book by Judy Thompson, who's non-Indigenous. She actually took years to do some research into especially the Yukon and the traditional clothing that people used to wear. So one of the things that I did during my language project was I was trying to get information about tanning hides, using materials of the animal to create clothing. And this image of this young boy really sparked a lot of memory for people in my community, because they remember wearing a garment similar like this, which is just all fur. So it's it's caribou, it's fox, beaver, I heard as well. And they were just bundled up. So this was a really important image to get some of my family's memories of long ago when they were these little kids in the bush, and what they might have been wearing. Another thing that I really liked from women's work, women's art, are these images here. They're actually of Tanana clothing that I can't see here. They're at the National Museum of the American Indian, I believe in Washington, and they give a sense of what some of the clothing might have been like for Indigenous peoples in my area, especially Upper Tanana people. So thinking about my own family and how this might relate, this is a picture of my great-grandfather, Little John, or White River Johnny, as he was formerly known as. And I love this image. My mom always likes this image too, like just his modern hat, these big army boots, and then all of a sudden he's just wearing this moose hide jacket. And if we zoom into the corners of his jacket, we can see this patterning here, most likely done by quills. That might be a button or something like that. So these kind of things started to really be of interest to me. And I wanted to think about clothing and I wanted to talk about it. And my grandmother and I visited her brother, Tommy, a couple years before he passed. And he kept talking about this garment. And I'm going to go back to this garment. He kept saying he wants a pair of hide pants, caribou hide pants, with the built-in moccasins. So if you can see down here, this actually has a little foot. So you just slip them on. You don't actually have another pair of shoes. It's your pants are your shoes as well. And Tommy kept referring to these pair of pants that he wanted Ada Gallen to make him. But sadly, both Tommy and Ada passed away. And I just kept thinking of that pair of pants or that shirt that my great-grandfather wore, and how might I replicate that in modern day. So something I like to say recently in regards to my projects are our traditions are not lost, they're not dead, they're not forgotten, and they're not abandoned. I like to say that they are sleeping and waiting to be awoken. These are all aspects that we can still find in our familial memory if we think about talking to our relatives, our older relatives, and helping them to engage with the past, to think about what were the things that they wore, what were the things that they remember their mom doing, like spinning sinew in her hands, or their grandma scraping off the meat and the flesh off the moose hide, right? So these are aspects of our culture that might not necessarily be so active today, but are certainly able to be reclaimed. So before I do that, I wanted to give a little warning. I do have some images of basically processing and going through and harvesting materials from animals. So if you have issues with this, please turn away. All right, so here's my first couple images. Noon is what we say to reference porcupine in Upper Tanana, Scottie Creek Dialect. My mom and I were really lucky enough to have, my mom's partner actually was able to kill this porcupine very close to us. And we quickly ran over and I got ready with my little blanket to start collecting quills. I had never collected quills before. I had processed quills before, cleaning them and things like that, because they were gifts. But I never actually took the quills from a porcupine. And I was really excited about this process, and it really launched a lot of my interest. So here's some of the quills. I'll be showing them a little bit later as well, but I got this huge coffee container full of the quills just from that one harvest. And now I'm just going to show a quick little video of how I actually clean quills. If anybody's interested, there should be no sound. There we go. So I take my quills, I usually dump them into, a bucket of fairly warm water. Some people boil quills or simmer them over a stove top. I'll then take my quills, clean them a little bit in some fresh water, some fresh, cool water. And using my fingers or using a paper towel, I take off all the crud, the little leftover bits and stuff from the porcupine quill, and just leave them to dry individually. All right, next, I wanted to talk about grouse and collecting feathers. This is something that I've processed, but not actually used in recent work right now. But my mom, the birthday girl, this is my mom here with her first kill. And it was a proud moment this year for me that my mom was able to do this. She caught this grouse and fed her parents the little pieces of grouse they're holding up and showing everyone. My grandpa's making a funny face because he doesn't really like it. But I collect grouse tails, and I'll actually be showing that after I stopped screen sharing. And finally, this is a big one that I've been focusing on recently. Actually, I might be talking about hair as well, but I wanted to talk about sinew. Sinew is really important for me right now, and it's something that I've been taking my time to process, especially through my master's program at Concordia University. I'm really focused on processing materials. So the arm right here is my mom's partner, Dwayne, and they had just gotten the backstrap off the moose. And here he's seen removing what we call the backstrap sinew from that chunk of the moose. And this is the little piece here. And like I said, after my screen share, I'll actually show you how this looks dry. And this is, I believe, my last material that I'll be talking about, but fur. So the use of fur or hair. While we were collecting the quills for the porcupine, we also collected its fur. I have horse hair from a friend, and my mom is seen here actually harvesting some of the back hair of the moose that they caught, that also I am processing its sinew. And I haven't started working with the hair yet, but I'll be probably working through tufting the hair. I wanted to offer this statement that I've recently written for my master's program, and I'm going to read it to you. I say, my mind was reluctant, but my hands were confident as they ran along the Danique Chitthi, pulling apart each fiber. The smell of flat Danique lingered in the air, reminding me of home. I took a small strip of fiber, wet it in my mouth, and bit down on one end. My hands proceeded to roll the fiber in a back and forth motion. Each fiber was given attention and care, and a thread of Chitthi was created. So that's kind of some thoughts on how I process sinew. Here's a little bit of information, but I believe Christina will put that also in the chat. And now I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can show you some of my actual pieces. Okay, so I wanted to first start with let's start with the feathers and the hair. So I hope you guys can see me. So this is, I'm just going to close this as well. This is one of the grouse tails that have been gifted to me. I often get gifted a lot of materials, which I'm very grateful for. This particular one is from my dad's partner, Bessie. and she gave me a whole bunch of these, and my mom is also collecting them for me as well. But we use this in Upper Tanana culture for like as fans, dancing fans and things like that. But as you can see, I haven't done anything else to it. I might put beadwork here. I might add it to a piece. That material hasn't been used yet. Next, I wanted to show you some fur or hair, I suppose I should say. This is horsehair that I've been working with. It's from a horse's tail that I got from a friend in Victoria. It's nice, long, very different colors. And I actually did use this in my last solo exhibition. I added dentalium shells to the ends and laid it over my mannequin's head to make it look more like hair. So I'm still figuring and feeling that out, but I really like the look. I like the feel of it. So I'm still processing and going through what I want to do with that, what I want to do with the horse's hair. And next, I wanted to show what porcupine hair looks like. So porcupine hair really looks like just extended porcupine quills, very similar. So this is the porcupine hair. I can actually smell it just like the day we were collecting the quills. So it's white tips right at the base, and then this nice long black hair. Very similar. It feels really similar to stuff like moose hair, which is very thick. And it's a material that I probably want to tuft with. And if you don't know what moose tufting is or what caribou tufting is, I highly recommend to look that up or look into artists that use that material because they produce some beautiful work. Secondly, or thirdly, I guess, I wanted to show some quills. So this is, I have a little label on here that says harvested and cleaned in 2020. So this is the little jar that I've been able to clean so far. Some people are much faster at cleaning quills than me, but I like to take my time, make sure each quill is nice and clean. But there's just some of the quills. As you can see, they're barbed. So there's the barb is actually on the tip with the black, and there is still a little bit of a point at the end. So if you're using this, most of the time people cut these two ends off so they don't get hurt. That's why we keep it in a container. Okay, and lastly, I wanted to talk about the sinew before we go on to Q&A. So the sinew that my mom and her partner Dwayne were able to harvest for me, they also dried it in the smokehouse. So this is how it looks smoked. So honestly, it looks just like a big piece of dry moose meat, except it's very, very fibrous, and you really can't see it here. You have to look closely, and I don't know if my camera is good enough, but in reality, it's very fibrous, and you can tell that this is how people made thread. So once you have it in this form, my mom and I stripped it, listening to my grandma's instructions over the phone, and you kind of get this mass of tangled fibers, and it's up to you to process it. And so I listened to my grandma. I remembered, seeing her do it. I remember the stories, and I was successfully able to actually make thread out of the sinew. And I have actually tried to sew with it. It is a very different material than things like nylon thread or fire line or any of those other beading threads. So this is the work that I was just practicing with. Like I said, I'm still a student. So using this, definitely, it takes a lot of practice. Your beads certainly don't lay flat in any way. And there's discrepancies in the size. So this is the longest sinew I was able to produce. And these are the shorter ones. And in the future, I'm going to try to see if I can attach the shorter ones to make them longer. So then I'm not stopping to switch out my sinew all the time. And so this is still all in process. I'm still working on this. I still have so much backstrap sinew to process and actually start using. But the final work that I have proposed for my MFA is actually to create and replicate those outfits that I showed you from the National Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian. I might start with smaller scale and then do it as an adult size, but that's my whole thought process. Is this next summer or the next 2 summers, I will be tanning, processing hides, everything that I can do myself or with family, and using my family's knowledge of these kind of processes. I want to recreate what we did in the past in modern times, because I don't feel like these are things that are lost. And I really do want to remind people that we are still capable of making everything from our clothing to our thread, to our needles and things like that. I know tanning hides has been a really big revitalization, especially in places like the Northwest Territories. There's huge production of home tanned or brain tanned hides right now. And it's really inspiring. And I hope that this is another level of inspiration for people to think about the uses of animals. I always think about thinking about the moose. It's so significant for my community. We eat it. My grandma eats every part of the moose, but then we have to think about the byproducts of those animals that we're not necessarily using anymore. Are we throwing out the hide? Are the bones just being given to dogs? Can we make something out of the bones? Having that conversation again of how can we actually process these animals to their full extent, and to help us in our daily lives is something that I'm really interested in. So I'm going to stop there for now and welcome Sheila back to help me with some Q&A. And yeah, I hope you guys have questions.
Hi, Teresa. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for that talk. It was really great. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about time and labor and the quietness that must be a part of your work, like the sort of stillness that you have associated with doing really meticulous repetitive work. And can you just talk to me a little bit about why you're attracted to that and what meaning might emerge in your artistic practice, like from when you start a project through all of that time? Mm-hmm. Like what's sort of that idea of the idea at the beginning, and how pieces sort of transform with all of the requirement of time?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I think a lot of people bring up with this type of work. Is it's very laborious. It's very time consuming. A lot of people are always in a rush, so they're not really attracted to things like this. But for me, when I first started to begin beading, I guess my grandma taught me when I was 7 or 8 years old how to bead. But I stopped, and because kids aren't really interested in that kind of stuff. I didn't actually pick up the beadwork until I was in my 3rd or 4th year of my undergrad at the University of Victoria. I was really stressed. I wasn't very happy with what I was doing in my classes. I was stressed with my archaeology classes, and just the way that it thinks about Indigenous people. So I started to rely on beadwork as a stress relief, because I could just sit there and just hours went by and I was like, wow. And it's very meditative. That's what a lot of people say when they're doing workshops with me, or if they are beaders. There's something about just being in oneself, taking the time to think. You really are able to open your mind up when you're starting to do this repetitive task on consistently. So there's a lot of time that my mind is working fast, but my body's just kind of still or doing this repetitive motion. So I get a lot of just, stress relief from it. It's I enjoy it. It's something that I like.
And
but it is, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, so there's the aspect of beading when you're by yourself alone in a room. And I'm just wondering if you also bead in community, like if that idea of sharing silence with others. I think we have very few opportunities in our daily lives to sort of share silence, just to be physically in the same room with someone, but have there be less pressure to talk, right? Or to be social. And I wonder, I know that I have had instances in my life as an artist where there was just that communal aspect of being in a room together and being, doing separate tasks, but feeling sort of less alone, like that mix of solitary and communal. And I'm wondering if you ever do that as part of your practice, or is that something you're
so,
to do? I mean, with your family, obviously do that, but I'm just wondering, like, if you have any sort of aspect of a practice that sort of consciously brings other people in.
Yeah. So I'm definitely an isolated kind of person. I like to work alone. I feel more productive when I'm alone. If I'm beading with other people, it's not about silence. It's actually about conversation. Right. And that's something that if I'm offering a workshop, or if I'm offering people to come sit with me and bead, there's this moment of silence, sure, when people are starting to learn how to bead. Especially if you're a beginner and you're still trying to figure it out, there's this like complete focus on this one thing. But after you move past that complete focus of this one thing, you start to get used to your hands moving in a certain way. And that really allows you to actually have really deep and meaningful conversations with the other person. So I see
that muscle memory, right? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, every time I have had these moments where I'm beading and things like that, I'm not actually, if I was trying to finish a project, it would never work with a group of people around me. But if I was just messing around or trying a new technique and things like that, and had a group of people around me, it's more about the conversation that's important in those moments, more so than like what you're actually trying to get done for a gallery or something like that, like something with a deadline, right? So I see, like, I have kind of two different perspectives when it comes to that.
Yeah. And I just wanted to ask you too, like, what is your current, like, the way that your work is different animals, etc. And I'm just wondering, do you see yourself having a relationship again with that idea of thrifting or the discard or things that are sort of commercially produced? Like, do you see there ever being sort of a remarriage of those things in your work, or how are you seeing that sort of those two aspects of your work either happening concurrently or somehow coming together?
Yeah, no, I think they're actually completely related. I think you hit the nail on the head right there. Because I do like to use like this series of fashion pieces were all reused and thrifted clothing, scraps of hide, these were straps that I found somewhere. Like, it was all about reuse. And something that happened to me, I guess, last fall, we came across this partially processed moose. And it was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. It was a non-Indigenous hunter, because if anybody from Beaver Creek was getting that moose, they would have taken all of it. But these guys left it, and it was rotting. If somebody had let us know, we could have actually saved that hide. We could have used the pieces that they left. They left like what we call guts, which are like the lower intestinal areas of the animal, and my grandma loves that to eat, and they just left it to rot, and they left it so close to community that it could draw in wolves and bears and things like that, animals that we don't want close to our community. And I got really frustrated when I saw that. I took pictures of it. I was digging around in there. I'm like, why would anyone leave all of this? And then I started to think about, okay, how do we process animals in the community? And for sure, they eat almost every part of the animal, but there are still things that are not used anymore, or not used as often anymore, like the backstrap. You know, the backstrap, it's this unusual part of the animal. I was trying to describe it on the phone with my mom. Her and, you know, her partner Dwayne were trying to like figure it out, but as soon as they saw it, they were like, that's it. It looks exactly like threads. It looks like fiber. It looks like that's what it could be. And so they were able to find that piece. And now they know, you know, in the future, there's somebody now to process those things. I can act as that process for them. I kind of can fit myself into, you know, these areas that people aren't sure, like, should we collect this? Should we not? We just leave the quills. We don't have any use for the quills, but there's lots of artists that need these materials. Lots of people in community that want to use these materials again. When I posted about the sinew, like, even some relatives were like, oh, you have to show me how to do that. I was like, and relatives. I was like, really? You don't know? Like, okay. So, you know, it just shows like that, yeah, some people don't have access to these knowledges, but they're really wanting to know, and they're curious. And I think that's an important part of what I'm starting to learn through this whole process is how to pass along this knowledge eventually to them once I figure out how to actually do this properly. Because like I said, I'm still learning.
So I'm just going to go to a question from a person you may know, named Julie Jai. It says, Teresa, thank you for this super interesting presentation. It's great to hear you and see you realize the traditional ways of making clothing. I've always wondered what people use the needles for back then. Question mark.
Mostly like bones is what I've heard, is actually like splitting the bone in a way that it kind of makes this smaller needle. And if you look at the thickness of my sinew, it's pretty thick. So I actually have to use stuff like an embroidery needle when I'm sewing with this. So an embroidery needle is quite large, and I could see a bone being about the same length or size of what you would need to actually use this type of sinew. This certainly could not be used for beading needles, like things that are small that we're so used to now. It's definitely heavier, bulkier. And that's why if we're looking at traditional clothing and embellishment on clothing, you know, there's a lot of quill work before beads. Quill work was the primary thing to be decorative on your clothing. And quill work could very well be used, like sinew could be used to do quill work, but it certainly can't put a little size 10 bead on this. I've tried, and I've tried to make these really small, and it's just, it can't be done. So I have to do my research on that a little bit more, but yeah.
So there's another question from someone in the Q&A. It says, hi, Teresa. It seems to me that you work at the intersection of art and craft, but I'm interested in hearing whether you would agree or disagree with that assumption. How would you describe your work in those terms, or would you use different terms entirely?
Good question. I avoid the use of the word craft. Craft is associated still in our society with what we call as women's work, things that are processes that are deemed as lesser than fine arts and things like that. So that's why I'm actually in a master's of fine arts, because I believe this is fine art, and that is what I'm creating. So yeah, I sway away from craft just because there's this ongoing assumption that it's lesser than, that for some reason it's done more by women, that they get paid less. Crafters get paid way less than artists. Crafters are also not seen as necessarily people that would be in a gallery, which is the world that I really like to live in. So it's a tricky one, especially in fibers workers, like people that actually work in fibers, embroidery, loom, like all these different types of ways of using fibers. We're still struggling with that. that it's kind of always inherently assumed that we're also craftspeople. But what does craftspeople mean, and how does it work? So I don't have any other definition for myself, though. I just call myself an artist. I'm one of few in the community that I think like actually claim the term artist. But yeah, that's just how I define myself.
I sometimes like the word maker.
Yeah, maker,
less loaded,
creator,
but
like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll be talking about art and craft and the definitions for another 500 years. And sometimes it's just exhausting and not very useful, I find. I don't know. It's like not helpful when you're actually just trying to get stuff done and make meaning, right?
Yeah.
It's less useful sometimes. So I guess a related question, in terms of art craft, like what about artist versus curator? How are you negotiating having that dual identity?
I think both help each other. Like if I'm doing curation, like I come with the artist perspective very much. How would I want my art to be presented? How would I want my art to be displayed, offered to people? Because the curator's interpretation of art could be wrong. And sometimes it is. And an artist is looking at their space and saying, well, that's not what I meant, but that's what that guy assumed. So I think of it in that way. And my background in anthropology helps with curation quite a bit, because I'm really attracted to what are people interested in, or what do people observe or notice first or witness. So I think it works together. And in my arts way, I don't necessarily think so much about curation. I think I get a little bit lost in my pieces, and like some of them kind of go together and some of them don't. And but like, especially when you're displaying solo exhibitions and you don't have a curator, you really have to take on that task of thinking, okay, how do I want people to come and enter the space? What do I want them to see first? So I think in some way, they influence me all the time, but I definitely call myself an artist, and an emerging curator is kind of the term that I've been using or defining myself with, just because I'm still so new to curation.
I often go to exhibitions and find that the curator's voice is very much present, very much front and center, and the artist's voice is sort of muffled or less present. And I sometimes find that disconcerting, or it just makes me uncomfortable in some way. So I sometimes worry that there's a shift, an ideological shift that's happening, and I hope that it becomes tempered at some point, where the artist's voice is as important as the curator's is. But who knows? We'll see how that all gets.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in one of the last exhibitions that I curated, the one at the Yukon Arts Center, Emerging North, it was strange because I would talk to the artists for months before the pieces were completed and before the exhibition, and they were telling me about their process and all of this stuff and getting my opinion and things like that. And then when I asked, oh, can you write your artist statement? Maybe it's like a little tiny paragraph, like 2 sentences. And I'm like, that's not enough. Like, there's so much more about their piece, but it's up to the curator to offer that as well, of like, hey, this little tiny statement isn't just it. They wanted you to know more, and it's up to the curator to translate that to the audience as well, right? So curator has to kind of be on top of things and always listening, always watching, just so then they can make sure that an artist's voice is fully embraced.
It's careful and nuanced work, though, right? You have to listen carefully if you're
absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm just going to read a question from a person I know, Lori Davis. It says, "Hello, Teresa. Thanks for this. I'm wondering if you could speak more about how you might be thinking about bringing together the contemporary subject matter and materials you have been using up to now. How might you how might you, or would you consider bringing your contemporary beading work practice to the project that you've described as your MA project?
Yes, anything we create today is contemporary because we're contemporary people and we live now and we exist now. And I'm very passionate about that because a lot of the times we're in museums, people kind of forget that Indigenous people actually still live or exist. They put us in the past so often. So I think anything that I create now, whether it's inspired by history or not, is certainly contemporary work. So I'm just taking inspiration from the past, but I'm also doing processes wrong. I'm not necessarily doing it the right way. I am processing the sinew by talking to my grandmother on the phone, not necessarily sitting there with her and showing me, and we're having this moment. So I'm learning it in a very contemporary fashion. Especially thinking about hide tanning, people that do brain tan, they're still using modern day chemicals to process the hide. Sometimes they're not, depends on what kind of scrapers you make. Are you going to make your scrapers out of bone or are you going to use metal? Does that make it any lesser than because we're not necessarily using all of the same materials that we used in the past? So yeah, to answer that, I definitely believe that my work is contemporary. In regards to decor or embellishment on the pieces, I'm leaning towards quill work, and I have not done too much quill work ever. But yeah, I'm really excited, and I really want to do quill work, and I want to look at just studying different patternings. I know a lot of, I tried the zigzag quill work, and that's your most basic standard style. But I want to get into different styles. And I think, quill work is definitely going to be my primary add-on to my pieces for my MFA. I think I'm going to avoid a little bit of beadwork because I want to think about before the arrival of non-Indigenous to the Yukon. So beads were mostly traded in from Russians off the Alaska coast. And brought inland to us. So I'm trying to think of before that happened. And so quill work is predominantly the thing that I'm going to be using. Yes.
So you described working on the phone with your family, right? Mm-hmm. Currently, just because of where you are geographically, right? Mm-hmm. So what is the difference between sitting next to your grandma and working on the phone? How are you negotiating that? That must be complicated.
Yes. I feel like I get more done in person. I learn more in person because it's not just hearing her voice. It's if I was in person, just last summer, when I was doing this language project, my grandma had this little pile, one of these little piles, and she was doing it. She was just sitting there and processing, and I was asking them about language. So I wasn't asking her about sinew, and I wasn't thinking about processing sinew, but I was watching her while we were talking about something else, and she's doing this process and spinning it and whatnot, and making these threads. And even though our conversation was nothing about what she was doing, I remembered what she did. So when I talked to her on the phone of specifically asking, Grandma, how do I do this? And her saying the words with me remembering what she was doing last summer, made it easier for me to keep up. But those are things that we have to pay attention, especially when we're working with our elders or just in a room with an older person. I think we take them for granted quite a bit, but they're offering so much. And the questions you are asking might not be the right questions. And that's what I found during my language project was I kept asking these certain questions and they're just sitting there looking at me like, what? That's not the question I want. I'm going to answer this. And they talk about something completely not what I wanted. But later when I listened to the recordings or stopped and thought about it, I was like, oh, they were teaching me so much more. And that's something, like I said, you know, I had the honor of existing at the same time as my grandma Bessie, sorry, my grandma Marilyn's older sister, because she was seen as this individual of, she knew so much. She hadn't attended residential schools, so she had her language. She had all of these different things that, you know, we struggle to reclaim today. But just even remembering her, or remembering her voice, you know, her broken English, because she'd rather speak Upper Tanana than English to you. Like, it just, that's such a nice memory, right? That's such a nice memory that I think about. But so it's using my own memory as well, but also just remembering that, like, these older folks and these elders are offering us a lot, and we just have to listen and be observant, I think. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Teresa. This has been really, really generous and great. Thank you so much. I've learned so much. It's really great.